So today is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, and today we're spending the show talking about an Indigenous artist who has made it his life's work to correct the record, subvert what is commonly accepted, and in the process, show the truth and also challenge colonial narratives. I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion. And today's show is about Kent Monkman. And before we start talking about Kent Monkman, I just want to introduce you to our group chat who's already here. Marion Newman is here, Riley Yesno is here, and Susan Blight is here. Hello to all of you. Welcome to the show.
Hello.
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 It's nice to have all of you here. Listen, I just want to take a moment and contextualize who Kent Monkman is. For nearly 4 decades, Kent Monkman's been challenging the representation of Indigenous people in Western art and reimagining historical events from an Indigenous perspective. And he works in a whole bunch of different mediums, right? He has these massive, super realistic paintings, installations, sculptures, and books, and also through his alter ego, which is a two-spirit figure called Chief Eagle Testickle. Well, now she's showing up in a whole new context, which is opera. It's called The Mischief Cycle, and scenes from it are being staged tonight at Bourgie Hall in Montreal. The group chat's here to talk about Kent Monkman's work in general, but also, Marion, you are a mezzo-soprano, and you are singing the role of Mischief. That is just so exciting. I'm so excited that you're doing that tonight.
So thank you so much for having me.
Yes, of course. Listen, before we get to the opera, maybe Susan, I'll start with you. I want to maybe try to paint a picture for everyone listening. And you know, like you're the artist among us. And so what you're going to do is maybe we'll have you explain what makes Kent Monkman's work so powerful. To give us a sense of what we get to look at when we look at a Kent Monkman work.
I mean, he has a wide-ranging practice, but I think that, you know, and it may be a very expected response, but when I think about his work and the power of his work and the impact of his work, I think a lot about the scream. This is a painting a lot of us are probably familiar with.
Yeah.
But it is also an image, I think, that has multiple layers. You know, on the one hand, it's Kent sort of intervening and interrogating a medium that has historically, until very recently, held Indigenous people as subjects, not as creators. We are some of the most painted or photographed people in the world, but until very recently didn't have the institutional power to make those images of ourselves. So those images become misrepresentations, you know, that were depicted through a colonial or imperial lens and results in exoticizing and fetishizing our images. And I think that Kent sort of plays with that medium a little bit. And so there's that idea, right, of making space into an arena that has historically not had space for us, except in a very specific way through a non-Indigenous lens. The other level here, I think, is of course, what the image is depicting, right? The children being torn, ripped from their parents' arms, kidnapped by uniformed police, you know, RCMP and priests and nuns. It's a very intense, visceral image. If we think about with the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the images that sort of stand in our minds of that time, the images are often institutional images of children standing in rows with priests and nuns, praying beside the bed, in classrooms in rows. This image is one of the first images I think we've seen of that actual moment, you know, that moment of children being ripped from their parents. It depicts the violence of that moment in a very intense and real way. And so that specific violence that the scream, I think, represents and through its representation and its size, right? They're very monumental paintings.
They're gigantic paintings, yes.
Yeah, I think really calls viewers to be witnesses
I
to
think
this history.
The description of visceral is exactly correct. I think like you see that image and you can't help but sort of like step into the feelings that you're sort of like seeing depicted. And it's incredibly sort of powerful reaction. Riley, what about you? Which images come to mind for you? Like what's the thing that makes those images powerful?
I mean, there are so many. I'm thinking about, the Scream. I'm thinking about, his like Indigenous matriarch series that he did, portraits of Indigenous matriarchs. But the ones that I really love, especially topically, are those series of Mischief. And I love that, you know, in that series of paintings, he's still talking often about colonial history. But instead of using the very, again, visceral, dramatic violence that you see in other works of his, like The Scream, humor is kind of like the doorway into the narrative, right? And flipping a lot of these colonial narratives on its head. I'm thinking of, where Indigenous people have been and Indigenous women and femmes and queers especially have been, exoticized and made into these like objects. He flips it, and I'm thinking of The Daddies is one on the top of my head right now, right? Where it's Miss Chief looking at the fathers of Confederation and she's like laying into them. And so it's funny to look at, but it's also a really important point about reclaiming what has been taken from us, reclaiming these narratives, and like putting us into future spaces also in many ways.
That sentence fragment, he flipped it, is sort of like the ways that that captures everything that sort of Kent Monkman tries to do, right? With this idea of, okay, you're used to thinking of this thing in this way. What if it was this way instead? And one of the most powerful tools for that has been this alter ego, Miss Chief Eagle Testickle. So Marion, we heard Riley sort of talk about Miss Chief a little bit. You are going to play her. You're singing the role of Miss Chief. Tell me a little bit about the idea of bringing her to the opera on a personal level. What does she mean to you?
Miss Chief is like the sister, like a big sister, that powerful woman that shows you that just put on your best outfit and face the world. Like, we are all bougie natives and we put our best foot forward at all times. She reminds me of my grandma. She always had like a beautiful hat with a pin that matched her ring, that matched her necklace, and shoes that matched her purse. And she really put her best foot forward. And I didn't realize until like really recently that she needed that to be powerful enough to face the kind of racism that she did on the daily. And she taught me how to stand up in the face of things that make me nervous, in the face of people who disagree or who refuse to learn, and just be who we are, be proud. And Miss Chief really represents that for me.
Marion, you just described a whole bunch of feelings that are like really wonderful to feel as an audience member, but you have to play her. What does it feel like for you to embody all those ideas?
Oh, I've played a lot of roles, and from most roles, I realize there's something in me that is a little like that person. And I can't wait for the effects of Ms. Chief to take place in my body. Because you learn how to be confident, how to be powerful, how to react in certain situations, phrases that you could consider saying. And Ms. Chief is so full of love at all times and so willing to listen. And I think that that's a wonderful example for someone like me to learn from.
Riley, you had an opportunity to interview Kent not too long ago. What does Ms. Chief mean to him?
Oh, yeah, that was such a fun interview. And we talked a lot about Miss Chief and how for him there was one layer of very much like reclamation, that he tells a story of taking the pictures of Miss Chief and the story back to his Cree advisors that were advising on the book. And they said, make it funnier and make it sexier. And he was like, okay. And I think this embracing of humor and sexiness was something important for him to say, like, that's Cree culture in many ways. And that was really something. The other part of this was, it opened up a new pathway to be telling those stories about colonialism that he had been telling for so much of his career, but in a way that felt extremely empowered, was a word that came up, fabulous, and created, a door opening for maybe a whole new audience of people to be able to see these stories in ways that they hadn't been able to see them before. And I think that was a really well accomplished goal. I, certainly even started to think about the stories differently, having seen Miss Chief lead the way. And so there's a lot of empowerment, even while dealing with things like the Fathers of Confederation or, police brutality or whatever it might be. Still, Miss Chief being so empowered, I think inspires an empowerment in the viewer. power.
I should say, we also work in we are talking right now and I can see you and I've seen Mischief. And so, but I forget sometimes that people also listen to us on the radio and maybe they have not seen Mischief. Riley, you've used the word empowered, you've used the word fabulous. Would you describe what it looks like to look at Mischief?
Yeah. So Mischief is based on, a drag persona that Kent had for many years before she became the subject of his painting. So in a way, she looks like Kent Monkman. So if you
Yes.
Google him, that'll be a good baseline for you.
Yeah.
But she also is usually in these paintings like wearing very few, if any, clothes, but also, not shying away from that. That's a huge part of what she's trying to do. Often she has this like very long headdress on, which I think in one way is a commentary on the way that Indigenous women, queer people, femmes, have been leaders in our communities for a millennia. And also, I couldn't help but see a picture of him that somebody put with the picture of Cher, right? When she dressed up very inappropriately as an Indigenous person wearing that big outfit. Again, a level of reclamation and fun and irony in it, and commentary on, forms of appropriation that he takes back in Mischief, that I think is really, really cool. So you can imagine Cher, Kent Monkman, nudity, and all of it's fabulous.
The idea of like, hey, what does Mischief look like? Well, if you take Kent Monkman and add a bit of Cher, but like appropriately so, and a lot of nudity, that's what you get. That's a beautiful, beautiful description. Real quick, Susan, you've seen Kent perform as Mischief. Take me to that experience. What kind of transformation do you see when you sort of see Kent as Mischief?
Well, it's funny because one of the first images I've ever seen of Kent's work is as Mischief. So I remember seeing a documentation of her performance during the Imaginative Festival. I apologize, I don't remember which year it was, but I was in my undergrad and saw it. It was a documentation of her performance that Kent did as Mischief on, this is, I guess, for Toronto people might know, the Big Rock that's in Yorkville. That Big Rock?
Sure do.
It must have a name. I don't know the name.
I honestly just call it the Big Rock, so that's good enough for me.
The big, the Yorkville Big Rock.
Yep.
So Mischief is on the rock, dressed to the nines, glamorous, sexy, beautiful, all of that, playing an electric hand drum. And it's reverberating off the condos in Yorkville. And to me, it stood as this image of Indigenous power based in beauty and grace and fabulousness and loud. And it was incredible. So yeah, that's my image of Mischief from the very beginning.
I gotta tell you, the consistency of the term fabulous returning as we talk about Mischief is totally wonderful. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion, and today is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Riley Yesno is here, Marion Newman is here, and Susan Blight is here, and we are talking about the 40-year career of Kent Monkman, because tonight, parts of the opera that he wrote about Mischief is going to be premiering at the Montreal Bourgie Hall. Look, from the beginning of his career, Kent Monkman has spent a lot of time trying to change a lot of things, trying to change the power dynamics in museums, in cultural institutions, cultural spaces. I want to play a moment from an interview that he did with Tom Power. He's talking about this really powerful moment for him when he was about 8 or 9 years old on a class trip to a museum in Winnipeg.
Inside the museum were dioramas, all kinds of belongings that belong to Indigenous people displayed. And the story, the narrative there, as told through the settler eyes, it made me feel like there was a big disconnection to what was outside the museum on Main Street. Those were like the Skid Row bars, and those were basically, I realized later, that was like the fallout of the colonial project. So here I am as this kid, looking at sometimes romanticized, depictions of Indigenous people, but really frozen in time. So there was really nothing to kind of bridge the gap to the present.
But Susan, bridging the gap to the present, that is not a small job. That is not a small job at all. How do you see Kent Monkman having bridged that gap between those artifacts and the way that Indigenous people were being represented in museums and the present? How does Kent fit into that?
Many ways. I think a lot about Kent's exhibition at the ROM, the Royal Ontario Museum, called Being Legendary. So the ROM, this is a space that has until very recently really excluded Indigenous peoples from real presence in the institution. And by real presence, I mean power and control over our own cultural production. Um, but excluded Indigenous people from having presence, but at the same time holding our cultural objects captive, to where we have to apply to see them and to visit with them. So that, the ROM really represents that kind of space, and there's spaces like that all over Turtle Island. And so that disconnect really represents a really profound injustice, right? The imbalance of power and an exploitative relationship between Canadian institutions and Indigenous peoples. But if we think about Being Legendary and those monumental paintings that were included in that exhibition, Kent used Indigenous community members as models for those paintings. So as a viewer, you're walking into the ROM, seeing these paintings and recognizing people that within those images. So he's in a very practical way, actually bringing us with him into what is one of the most well-known museums in Canada, you know? So that idea of like the representation itself being made by Indigenous people, being made by Kent is one layer. The next is depicting real Indigenous peoples, depicting the truth of the colonial history in Canada, and then implicating institutions in that oppressive colonial history by virtue of what the painting is depicting. To me, it's a really powerful gesture towards Indigenous power and brilliance.
It's one thing to want to change those institutions. It's a whole other thing to make them listen, right? It's a whole other thing to sort of be able to, with the art that you create, be able to make them listen. And that goes from anything from, cultural institutions to the opera. And I'll get to that in just a moment, Marion, because I want to talk about that. That's really fascinating to me. But Riley, clearly one of the themes of Kent's work is this idea of taking up space. Like there's a confidence, there's a power in the art that he creates that commands this kind of attention. How do you describe the effect that he's had on artistic institutions, the way that they have had to respond to Kent Monkman's work?
Yeah, I mean, I imagine it must feel like a real weight of responsibility and obligation to be Kent Monkman sometimes, because he is so much. I think, like, when people think about, who are the biggest living artists today, never mind just Indigenous artists, Kent Monkman will come to mind. And he uses, I think, that position he has and the access that he's, been able to build for himself and the name over the course of his career, I think, to keep pushing, right? Like we're seeing now, even with this new layer of this opera, that it's not like, okay, well, I'm in, this gallery now, or I'm in this museum now, and that's it for the story. Kent continues to bring back new characters and new narratives and into whole new mediums. And what that does is, yes, not only expand people's knowing of him and his work and all of those things, but it does start to make room, especially when, a curator or a museum board or whatever sees how the community responds to it. Like Being Legendary was a hugely popular exhibit that the ROM had. And it's not just because it was Kent Monkman, though it was, but because it signaled how Indigenous community is like ravenous to come in and take our space that is ours and our cultural creation and all of those things, and see ourselves reflected in these institutions. So with that great responsibility that he has, I think that the taking up space is a deliberate part of like living up to those obligations that I imagine comes with being an artist of that stature.
So, Marion, it's one thing to sort of subvert and sort of force those institutions to respond to you. If we're talking about museums and we're talking about different cultural institutions, the way that decolonizing opera fits into this, that's new to me. I think it might be new to a lot of different people. Why opera now, do you think?
Humans have been telling stories through song because it is such an effective way of making someone understand and remember what you are saying. It's loud. Opera's loud. We deserve to be loud now. And I mean, I'm from big house people. We have potlatches. And in those potlatches, all of our stories and narratives are told through song. And we have regalia. uh, like beautiful regalia and masks so we can become different creatures. There used to be like rope flies through the big house, I hear. I understand we used to have trap doors so someone could just appear out of nowhere, seemingly. Like that is theater.
Yeah.
And we were doing that a long time ago. And so, why wouldn't we continue to do that now? If we had actually just walked side by side, which is what I think should have happened when people originally arrived, we would have taken on some of their ways and they ours, and we would have realized we've all been doing opera. It's not just European, but it is a human way to tell a story. It's emotional, it makes people listen.
So after your performance, you're going to be doing this public event with Kent and with Jeremy Dutcher about that exact thing, about what it means to use European colonial art forms to tell Indigenous stories. What is the most important aspect of that conversation from your perspective in terms of like how you want to sort of descend into it?
I think it's so important that we take up space everywhere we can. And there's this idea that opera is just for the elite, which isn't even true in Europe. It was really an art form for everyone. And we need to take those walls down. And those people who think that they're going to go to the opera to be safe from having to hear about us aren't even safe there. You know, it's time to just put aside their fears, open up their ears and hearts, and hear the truth. Hear the truth through our words and our melodies, and like take us seriously everywhere. We belong. We belong there.
I want to sit a little bit with that sentence, that thing that you said, you'll be safe from seeing us there. This idea that like that's a space where you talk to me a little bit about that framing. What did you mean by that?
Well, I mean, it was touched on earlier, like the idea of how we were seen in museums was something of the past. And we were frozen in time when the potlatch ban went into place. We were not allowed to continue evolving, showing who we are. It was illegal to sing our songs. It was illegal to practice our ceremonies. And we were just meant to either not survive at all, or if we did, as indentured servants. And we were never meant to be that. And that's something that Kent really shows us all, is that we are powerful. We have remained powerful through this. Miss Chief has shepherded us through a lot in the telling of Kent's view of how we got through it all. And it's just bring it back to that gaze, the settler gaze, and the wish that we would just remain silent. Like if things could just go back to the way we were, it would be so much easier for everyone. But everyone doesn't include us. It's so much easier to get to be who we are as powerful human beings alongside everyone else. Honestly, it really is so much easier now for me than it was for my grandmother and for her grandmother. So if people would just open their hearts, they would realize we are part of a safe space. And we make a space safer for everyone by being who we are and getting to share our ways from way back when to now. Like we have actually kept evolving out of the public eye. And just because we are humans, we are curious, we are smart, we just do that. And so here we are. We are doing this walking side by side in the most graceful way we possibly can. And people can learn from that and understand we are not something to be afraid of. That's their imaginations that they ought to fear.
I so desperately wish I could see that conversation between you and Jeremy and Kent, because that sounds like an absolutely incredible conversation. We've spoken about Kent Monkman's art and the way that he's transformed attitudes within cultural institutions and beyond. But what I want to read is something that Giselle Gordon shared with us. She's Kent Monkman's longtime collaborator, and she's a librettist. Here's a problem with me being not an opera person. For the Miss Chief cycle, here's a quote. As a settler working in the Indigenous cultural world, I'd suggest a subtle yet important point to clarify that the work of truth and reconciliation is the work of settlers to do. Kent and other Indigenous artists are providing new pathways for settlers to learn, to see our shared history with new eyes. That's very much in conversation with the thing that Marion was just talking about. I'm curious, how does Giselle's comment land for you as you hear it, Susan?
Powerfully, and this is a critique that was launched during the when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released their final report and the calls to action, which is the idea of reconciliation implies that both parties are somehow at fault, and that's just not the case. And I do think that if we are serious about a better relationship, that it is incumbent upon Canadians, and specifically people who have benefited from settler colonialism, to do that work, to understand not only the colonial history, but as we talked about with Kent's work, the contemporary impacts of that history.
Riley, I think the greatest artists of their time make a new thing possible, right? Like the greatest artists of their time transform the way that you see the world. What is now possible because of Kent Monkman's work, you think?
I mean, a lot. I think that one of the things that stands out to me when I see is that I love that there's, in a way, Kent doesn't compromise on the things that and I think a lot of other Indigenous people in settler colonial institutions have felt that they had to compromise. Like the indigeneity and the queerness doesn't have to be like, he doesn't have to just be an Indigenous artist. He can be very much a queer artist as well. And those things get to exist together in the biggest institutions there are. That the story and the harshness of the story of colonialism can exist with the joy and the humor and the love of our communities. Those things get to exist together. So this idea that you don't have to leave a piece of you at the door, whatever door that might be in this country, I think is a really important one. The other thing I think is, like, I remember listening to a lecture at the ROM actually by Jesse Wente a number of years back, and he pointed to Kent Monkman and Jeremy Dutcher and talked about the way that he saw first of all, artists as always, they're ahead of the curve all of the time, and that they show us the way to the future, and that what they do by mixing their mediums of Indigenous storytelling and opera, or, if you are not really into the art world like I am, you'd look at Kent and be like, that's a Renaissance painting is what it looks like, right? And that's a very, I think, colonial medium in many people's minds, is that they show that the future is reclamation, and it's also taking what has happened through the process of settler colonialism and making it more, is what Jesse Wente said, making it more than what the Renaissance painters in Italy thought, that medium could be, is what Kent's doing with it. And I think that is happening, yes, first in the art world, but that we should continue to see that happen in education institutions, in healthcare, in justice, in all different sort of places. So we should always look to the artists, I think, to figure what the rest of us should be doing.
I guess, Susan, last word to you on this idea of art as opening some kind of door, right? Like this thing that Riley was just talking about, because there are a lot of ways to have this conversation. Also, or you can engage with the art that does that conversation. That's art tends to open the conversation much deeper than anything else can. So tell me about the kinds of conversation that Kent Monkman's work sort of tends to open up.
I think, yeah, I think art seeks to ask questions rather than provide answers. The answers are there for you to determine for yourself. And I was thinking this morning, reflecting upon the idea of opera and Kent making an avenue into this world. And certainly Marion, has spoken really eloquently about how powerful that is. And if you think about, for instance, powwow, right, as an intertribal cultural production, the Cree Nation has certainly contributed to powwow. So, in powwow, singing is operatic music, but probably not recognized as so. So these things that Kent is doing are continuations or continuums of ancestral power and knowledge. And I would also say that he shows us courage and bravery. It takes courage to have these kinds of conversations, to depict these things, not only for a non-Indigenous gaze or a settler gaze, but for our own people. These are contentious and sensitive things to attend to in your work, because we lived it.
Yeah.
Our parents lived it, our grandparents lived it, and our ancestors lived it. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Marion, you got emotional a little bit earlier, but I want to ask you about because I think you got emotional because this has personal stakes for you, right? Like it's sort of like it's sort of deeply embedded in your own personal life. So let me ask you, what has Kent's work made possible for you personally?
I think because I'm involved in the opera world, the first time I saw Kent's work, I realized it's on an operatic scale. And it is just so beautiful, huge, proud. It has opened an avenue for other artists to do works of such a magnificent size as well, and to take up spaces in galleries. It makes me feel like I belong there. And I mean, I know I've already kind of made a niche for myself in the opera world, but our stories belong there too. And I think that we have actually been telling our stories through song and opera in the classical world for some time now. But I think that with mischief comes the mischief, the sense of humor, the fun part of who we are as Indigenous people, as well as the truth, because we're all full of all of that. We are very multi-layered, and our experience in the world includes a lot of joy, because we would never be here if we weren't laughing as well. And so, yeah, I think it's just I'm so honored to get to be part of this new chapter, this song chapter of Kent's, because I think it's helping me to continue down this journey in a good way.
That's a lovely and beautiful place to leave it. I really appreciate your time, both of you, all three of you. Thank you so much for being here today. This has been lovely. Thank you again.
Thank you. Miigwech.
Thank you.
Marion Newman, whose traditional name is Ngega, is a mezzo-soprano from the Kwagule and Stalo First Nation in BC. You can hear her host Saturday afternoon at the Opera on CBC Music. And tonight, she performs in scenes from the Mischief cycle at Borgie Hall in Montreal. Riley Yesno is an Anishinaabe scholar, writer, and commentator from the Imabetung First Nation in Northern Ontario. Susan Blight is an Anishinaabe artist from the Couchiching First Nation in Ontario. And by the way, CBC is marking the 5th National Day for Truth and Reconciliation on all our platforms, so please make some time for the rest of our programming. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion. We'll see you tomorrow.